exciting and timely symposium on such an important topic. And during the last few years, my lab has gotten involved in research that tries to directly link cognitive and cognitive neuroscience issues on the one hand with education on the other. However, that's not really what I'm going to be talking about this morning. To hear about that work, you're going to have to wait to hear Carl Spooner's talk this afternoon. He'll talk about the real direct links to education coming out of our lab work that he's led over the past few years. My talk is going to be more of a basic talk about the nature of memory, one particular type of memory, episodic memory, and try to hammer home a point that's emerged in recent work from our lab that, at least at a broad level, I think should affect understanding of memory as it relates to the classroom, and that's the basic message captured in the title, Remembering the Past to Imagine the Future. That memory is not just about going backwards in time, recollecting and reminiscing. An important function of memory, and episodic memory, which I'll define in a moment in particular, has to do with how we use it to think ahead, imagine, and plan for the future. And an early observation that supported a strong link between remembering the past and imagining the future came from some observations made way back in the 1980s when I was at the University of Toronto working with Endel Tolving about an interesting amnesic patient. Can everybody see the slides okay? Patient known by the initials KC, who sadly passed away just a few months ago in his early 60s. KC in the early 1980s suffered a closed head injury that produced a severe amnesic syndrome. He could not remember a single episode from his past, even though other intellectual functions were relatively intact. The key observation here occurred one afternoon in the early 1980s when Endel Tolving and I were testing KC on various aspects of memory, and Tolving asked him a simple but important question. Try to imagine what you're going to do tomorrow and tell me what that might be. And KC just sat there in front of us and drew a complete blank when asked that question. The same kind of blank he would draw if you asked him, tell me what happened yesterday. He can't tell you what happened yesterday. The best he could do was come up with some generic or script-like information. I might have breakfast and I'd have lunch, but he couldn't conjure up a single scene of what might happen, an episode in his mind. And that led Endel Tolving, pictured here initially, to suggest that episodic memory, which Tolving defined as the ability to recollect our past, travel back in time, may be important for the future as well. That was an interesting observation, but curiously, not much was done about it in our field for many, many years, in fact, for several decades, until the early mid-2000s when research in a number of labs, including my own, started to look at this issue in a serious way and potentially has important implications for how we think about memory. And it turns out that this initial observation of KC was not idiosyncratic. There are other things that point the same direction. So, for example, there are other amnesic patients who have difficulties imagining future events or conjuring up novel scenes. Not all amnesic patients have this problem, but many of them do, subsequent research has established. Cognitive studies have shown that various experimental manipulations have notably, strikingly similar effects on tasks that require people to remember the past and imagine the future. There have been studies of various psychopathological populations, including normal and abnormal aging, and various psychopathological groups that show that there's a reduction in what I'm calling episodic specificity of past events that's parallel when people imagine the future. So older adults, for example, when they remember the past, tend to retrieve fewer episodic details about what happened, who was there, where did it happen. You get a bit of a sketchier episodic memory from an older adult from the younger adult compared to a younger adult. Well, you see exactly the same thing when older adults imagine the future. The future imaginings contain less episodic specific detail, and that has been documented in abnormal aging, Alzheimer's disease, depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder. disorder. For those of you who want to get caught up on this line of work, I've cited here a review that I wrote with several others who've been very active in this area, including Carl Spooner, published in Neuron about a year and a half ago. And then finally, and we also cover this in detail in the review, there have been a bunch of neuroimaging studies that show when you put people in the scanner and you give them a cue and ask them to remember an event from their past or imagine an event that might plausibly occur in their future, you see striking similarities in brain activity. So this was an early study along these lines that was led by Donna Addis in my lab, and Carl Spooner and Kathleen McDermott published a similar study around the same time. And in this study, people were in the scanner, given cue words, instructed to, for example, imagine an event related to the word that happened to you within the past year, to remember an event that happened within the past year, or with another cue word, imagine an event that might plausibly occur, vacation. Imagine a vacation you might take within the next year. You're in the scanner and you mentally fill in what that vacation looks like. And the important result was that compared to various control tasks that had similar cognitive demands but did not require people to remember or imagine personal episodes, you could see there were some striking similarities in the brain regions that were active, particularly these posterior midline regions, including posterior cingulate and retrosplenial cortex, and medial prefrontal regions, strikingly similarly activated during remembering the past and imagining the future. There were several other regions as well that we and others noted. And so in a review paper published in 2007 with Donna Addis and Randy Buckner, we argued for the existence of what we refer to in that paper as a core network that's involved in remembering the past, imagining the future, and perhaps supporting related mental simulations involving prominently those two midline regions that we just saw, the medial temporal lobe, and a couple of lateral and parietal regions. Linking this work to other work that I'm interested in on constructive memory and memory distortion, and the question of why memory is sometimes prone to error, Donna Addis, again, 2007 was a very busy year for us, put forth what we call the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. And this is the idea that one of the ways in which we use our episodic memory is not, again, just to retrieve the past, but to imagine possible future scenarios. Episodic future thinking, episodic simulation. And this kind of constructive activity, using bits of memory to construct possible future episodes, requires a memory system that provides flexible access to elements of past experience that you can recombine at will to imagine different ways in which the future might play out. And so we argued that this kind of flexibility is adaptive when you're attempting to use memory, to use your past experience to figure out different ways in which the future might unfold, but we also suggest it can result in memory errors when elements of past experiences are miscombined. So that's kind of our link between future thinking and constructive memory. Now, one important point made by this constructive episodic simulation idea is that the ability to flexibly recombine elements of past experiences into simulations of these novel future events is highly adaptive. In fact, we're arguing that that really helps us enough that it's worth any cost in memory errors for having this kind of very flexible memory system that allows you to flexibly recombine information. And that's an argument I made in an American Psychologist paper published a couple of years ago. But you can raise the question of whether episodic simulation, using episodic memory to simulate alternative future scenarios, really is adaptive, because there's evidence out there from different literatures that has revealed pitfalls of this process of simulating the future. So, for example, limitations of episodic simulations, it's been shown in some nice work by Dan Gilbert and Tim Wilson, can sometimes mislead us to mispredict how happy we're going to be in the future, because our episodic simulations are constrained by some of the limitations of our episodic memory. Similarly, David Dunning's argued that simulation of the future sometimes it gets us into trouble, such as with the planning fallacy, where based on past experience we misestimate how long it's going to take us to complete a task. Another point that could be used to raise questions about The usefulness of episodic simulation concerns the brain network on which episodic simulation seems to rest, what we refer to the core network. Those of you familiar with cognitive neuroscience research will know that that core network pretty substantially overlaps with what's known in the literature as the default network. It's exactly those same regions, and the default network a little over a decade ago was initially identified by deactivations. When people were given in the scanner demanding, goal-directed tasks that required a lot of cognitive effort, these regions would typically show decreases. They showed increased activity when people were just staring at a fixation cross and not doing much of anything. What I call here passive rest states in the slide. And indeed, activity in these default or core network regions that are linked to remembering the past, imagining the future, is seen when people mind wander during demanding working memory tasks. This is a slide from a paper by Mason and all published in Science in 2007, showing activation of some of those key default network regions when people self-reported mind wandering off task when they're supposed to be doing a demanding working memory task. Those times when they said, whoops, I'm off task, that's when you see these default network regions coming online. And of course, mind wandering can interfere with goal-directed cognition. It can get in the way of getting tasks done. That's been shown in work by Schooler and Smallwood, Kane and others. And Carl Spooner will tell you about some of the work from our lab that relates mind wandering to reduced retention of information from lectures. You hear about that later today. Well, what then are the functions of episodic simulation? Here we've seen a couple of drawbacks. We've seen that it's linked to a brain network that often comes online when we're engaged in what some people would call task-irrelevant behavior. That doesn't augur well for the argument that episodic simulation is such an adaptive process. Well, one important point to note is that there is evidence out there that even though the default network is associated, for example, with mind wandering, it can contribute to functionally useful goal-directed processing associated with constructing, for example, complex autobiographical plans. So what I'm referring to here is a study that was led in my lab by Nathan Sprang, a former postdoc, where instead of putting people in the scanner and just asking them to imagine some event that might occur next week, which isn't really a very demanding task, it says that doesn't involve much goal-directed cognition, it's more like daydreaming about what might happen. People were in the scanner in Nathan's study, and they were given much more complex autobiographical plans to mentally construct. For example, construct a plan involving 2 steps and that would allow you to prepare for a study for an exam. So your plan has to include 2 concrete steps and how you're going to avoid a designated obstacle. Similarly, it could be planning a vacation. Here are 2 steps you've got to integrate into your plan, and here's an obstacle you've got to figure out your plan and how you're going to overcome. So this is a bit more complicated than just imagine what might happen next week. And the key result from the Sprang study was published a few years ago, initial one in a series, is that you do indeed see increases throughout this core default network when people are doing an autobiographical planning task compared to a control task. Another key point is that further analyses showed what I'm calling here task-related connectivity analyses. These are analyses aimed to look at not just are these regions active during a task, but how do they couple with other brain networks. So one of the things people have gotten very interested in recently in cognitive neuroscience and neuroimaging is kind of the coupling between different brain networks that have been identified. And a neat result from this study is that when they're doing the autobiographical planning, not only does the default network come online, but these task-related connectivity analyses showed that the default network's activity was coupled with that of a distinct network, what I'm referring to here is a frontal parietal control network. That's a network that in other studies has been identified with kind of executive control, goal-directed cognition, and the like. These two things were working together during autobiographical planning, again, indicating these default network regions can contribute to goal-directed cognition and can couple with other relevant networks. And these results were replicated and extended to older adults in a cerebral cortex paper in 2012 and further in a Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience paper in 2013. Okay, now along this general theme, here we saw some neuroimaging evidence related to people imagining events in the future and how the default network relates to planning. Well, there's some good behavioral evidence indicating that future simulations can actually enhance different aspects of planning. So there's a big literature out there on a phenomenon known as implementation intentions that's linked most prominently to Peter Gallwitzer, and I've just cited a well-known paper from 1999. There's lots of work since that time. And implementation intention is where it's kind of like a form of prospective memory, if you will, where people form an association between a cue and a future behavior. So if I encounter X, then I will perform Y. So I might simulate if David introduces me, I will go up and give a talk. That would be a pretty simple implementation intention. But what Gallwitzer has shown is that these kinds of implementation intentions, and various people have shown, can be facilitated when you construct a full-blown simulation of the future scenario. You do better in this and other related prospective memory situations. More directly related to educational concerns, there are a series of studies, very nice studies, out of Shelley Taylor's lab in the late 90s on future simulations that showed, for example, that a certain kind of future simulation could be helpful for college students as they plan and prepare for exams. So they have an upcoming exam, and the dependent measure was actually how well they did on this exam. And when people construct what Taylor called process simulations, these are simulations where you imagine yourself carrying out the steps needed to do well on the exam. I imagine myself going to the library, I imagine myself taking detailed notes. When you construct a process simulation, you do better on the exam than a control group, and also, critically, than a group that constructs an outcome simulation. Outcome simulation is imagine how great it would feel to get an A. Imagine yourself shaking hands with your teacher after you get a good grade. That doesn't help. But a future simulation that includes the steps, kind of like the spring autobiographical planning task, does indeed boost subsequent performance. And recently we did, in my lab, a study on process versus outcome simulations using fMRI. This is a study led by a now former graduate student, Kathy Gerlach. It's at least available online in Social Cognitive Affective Neuroscience. And in this study, people were scanned while they were constructing process simulations. Imagine what you need to do to prepare for a vacation, or outcome simulations. Imagine the activities you'd be enjoying while on vacation. And the key result was that when you looked at activity that was greater during process simulations than outcome simulations, what you found was, again, evidence for core network regions on the left, default network regions, and coupled activity in regions within the frontal-parietal control, executive regions. That occurred for process simulations. During outcome simulations, you also got your default network, but its activity was then coupled with reward-related regions, not with these regions on the right that are more typically associated with goal-directed tasks and executive performance and the like. Okay, point two, a related point on the utility of episodic simulations, that there's now evidence that episodic simulations can enhance problem solving. Very closely related cognitive task to planning. One study that I like in particular came out of University of Toronto from Morris Moscovich's lab. It was It's led by Signe Sheldon. And they did a study where people were asked to generate simulations, mental simulations, future simulations, of how they would deal with various hypothetical social scenarios using what's known as a means-end problem-solving task. I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail in a few minutes when I tell you about some work that's come out of my lab on this topic. The means-end problem-solving task, I give you a starting situation. So-and-so is having problems with her friends and wants to solve this problem. That's the beginning of the story. Her friends are avoiding her. The end of the story is the same person now is having a good time with her friends. How did you get from A to B? What do you do to get from a point where your friends are avoiding you to a happy situation where you're back having fun with your friends? So that's kind of a means-end problem-solving task. And what Sheldon and all found was that older adults in their 70s compared to younger adults exhibited impaired performance on this task, so they were coming up with fewer relevant means or steps to solve the problem. They also had access to fewer episodic details to help in constructing these simulations, and the two were linked together. So it seemed as though there might be a deficit in episodic simulation there, where older adults weren't getting the full benefit of generating detailed future simulations that was helping other older adults in task performance. So, seeing this evidence and evidence from other studies on the potential importance of accessing episodic details and building future simulations, over the past few years in my lab, we've gotten interested in the question of if there's anything we can do to boost access to episodic detail for purpose of enhancing future simulation, enhancing problem solving. And I want to spend most of my remaining time telling you about a few studies in the lab led by a graduate student, Kevin Medor, where we've been targeting episodic retrieval mechanisms, what I'm going to refer to as an episodic specificity induction. This is some work that just came out in the JP Learning, Memory, and Cognition. What do I mean by episodic specificity induction? I'll call this brief episodic retrieval training that can help a person adopt a specific orientation toward memory or imagination in our problem solving, as you'll see. As our episodic specificity induction, we used a well-established technique known as the cognitive interview. That was something developed about 20 years ago by Fisher and Geisman at UCLA at the time as a forensic protocol that they used to try to enhance accurate eyewitness recall. We have nothing to do in this study with eyewitnesses. We're using it as an experimental tool to try to boost up episodic retrieval and episodic orientation. So we're going to try to target mechanisms selectively, and in this first experiment I'm going to tell you about, our goal was to see, for reasons I don't have time to unpack fully, whether we could dissociate mechanisms involved in remembering and imagining on the one hand, which we think rely on episodic memory and draw on episodic detail, from describing a picture of everyday scene on the other hand. And that's a task that we would think wouldn't require and shouldn't recruit episodic memory. Just tell me everything you can about the picture in front of you. So if this induction really targets episodic processes, the prediction would be that it'll affect episodic memory, it'll affect episodic simulation, it won't affect performance in describing the picture. So here's the method, 24 young, and this actually came out of some earlier work we did with aging. So there's an aging component, 24 healthy older adults participated. There are 2 sessions, they're spaced a week apart. In session 1, you see a short video, it's just of people doing stuff in a kitchen, ordinary actions. And then you're given either the specificity induction, which I'll describe in a minute, where you're going to be remembering that video in extensive detail, or a control induction that I'll describe. And then you go on and you do tasks where we're going to give you picture cues and ask you to either remember a past event, imagine a plausible future event that could occur related to a picture of an everyday scene, or just describe the picture in the picture description task. Session 2, you see another short video. It's similar to the one you saw in session 1, people doing different stuff in a kitchen. You get out of the specificity or control induction, whatever induction you didn't get previous time. It's all counterbalanced, of course, within subject's design. And then you get similar kinds of memory and imagination and description tasks with different items. You're remembering a past event, imagining a future event, or describing a picture. So here's what the specificity induction looks like. You're given various kinds of probes that really get you focused in on the details of your memory for what was in that video. When you close your eyes, get a picture in your head about the people in the video you saw, think about what they look like, what they're wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people. Try to be as specific and detailed as you can. The control induction gets you thinking back on the video, but you're just giving your general impressions. Did you like the video? When do you think that the video was made? So it controls for thinking back to the video, but you're not being asked to retrieve episodic detail. And then the main task, we don't have to go into all the details, but the critical point here is that you're given these pictures, you're being asked to remember past events, imagine future events, or describe a picture, and these then are broken down into two critical categories. Internal details, that's basically the episodic detail. How much detail do we get about what you remember, what you imagine, or what is actually in that picture? External details are more facts, commentary, reflections, that are often part of an autobiographical narrative, but they're in this scheme developed by Brian Levine and all, they're coded separately. And for picture description, external details would be inferences about what's going on, off-topic comments and the like. So we're really most interested in the effect on internal details. And the critical result of this experiment is basically a three-way interaction. Consistent with predictions, the specificity induction boosts performance on memory and imagination tasks. Internal details has no effect on picture description. So there are the effects basically showing both young and older adults are producing more internal details, episodic details in memory and imagination. The red bars are higher than the blue bars, but there's no effect whatsoever on picture description. And there's no effect at all on external details, as predicted, because that's not episodic information. So the specificity induction selectively seems to target episodic retrieval processes and dissociates those episodic retrieval processes from semantic retrieval that we think supports external details and non-episodic narrative processes that we think are involved in picture description. Armed with those data, we then went on to do another study, also led by Kevin, currently under review, looking at whether the specificity induction would boost performance on this means-end problem-solving task, which we think benefits from constructing detailed simulations of the scenario. So basically here we use these social problems that go back to Platt and Spivak. This is what I mentioned earlier. Jay noticed that her friends seemed to be avoiding her. I want to have friends, and she wanted to have friends and be liked. The story ends when friends like her again. You begin the story where Jay first notices her friends avoiding her. You construct a simulation of how she got from A to B. So a relevant step is when in your simulation you come up with a step or event that moves the protagonist toward her goal. For example, she asked one of her friends what was wrong. That would get you closer to solving the problem. An irrelevant step is something that moves you away from the goal. She joins a new club to make new friends. Well, that doesn't help address the problem that her friends are avoiding her. And then there are other kinds of things that are coded as no step. We all, because some of these means-end problems are not exactly relevant to our subject, like stealing a diamond, and particularly for older adults, we thought was a little off topic. So we constructed also a separate condition, having personal goals that are judged as relevant by both young and old. And so here, there are self-relevant problems that are phrased toward you. How would you do various things to eat better, stay mentally active, and so forth? Both older adults and younger adults like those. Turns out that manipulation doesn't matter at all, but we get our effects for both. The paradigm is very similar to what I described before. You get that video, either an episodic specificity induction or a control induction, and then you get the problem-solving task, and we also throw in memory and imagination tasks just to make sure we can replicate our previous effects. And we do replicate those previous effects. So on memory and imagination, everything is exactly what I told you before. The specificity compared to control induction boosts episodic memory and boosts episodic stimulation. And if we look at the MEEPS task, we replicate the effects of Sheldon et al. So collapsed across the inductions. Older adults are coming up with fewer relevant steps, both for the self-relevant and standard MEEPS problems. They're constructing less detailed simulations, and those less detailed simulations are associated with poor performance on the MEEPS task. But the key result then is that the induction has an effect for both younger and older adults. The effect is significant. It's not a huge effect, but it's a reliable effect, boosting generation of relevant steps and not having an effect on other steps. So there we've seen that episodic stimulation can enhance problem solving. And I'll just mention, I don't have time to go into some related work on episodic stimulations that shows that they can enhance psychological well-being and empathy. So there's work showing that when women with first-time pregnancies were asked to simulate going to labor, arriving at the hospital on time, those who constructed more detailed simulations of this future event ended up worrying less and reported a better state of well-being than did those with less detailed simulations. And an interesting line of work that I can only mention, led by Brendan Gester, a former graduate student in my lab, published recently with the NES, we found that if you mentally simulate helping a person in need, that increases stated pro-social intentions to help that person, willingness to help. If you construct a very detailed scenario of helping, that has an effect on empathy or pro-social intention. So to close then, I think that we've seen evidence for several positive functions of episodic simulation. It's consistent with the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis and the general idea that episodic simulation is what I've called an adaptive constructive process. And while, again, much of this work is based in the laboratory, we think it does have applications, particularly, for example, the specificity induction, potentially in appropriate real-world situations. I want to thank members of my lab, collaborators, and of course thank funding agencies for their support, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. I have a question about all of this is excellent. And if I think about the role of implicit memory, the goal is really to predict the future. The previous events that the past events lay down habit traces that when I encounter that event in the future, they get kicked in. So I'm wondering if there's been any work on sort of the neuroimaging side that ties that in.
It's an interesting question. There's really, with the NIST event, there's been very little work that parallels the standard implicit-explicit distinction within memory. Carl actually did a nice study on this a few years ago, kind of a priming the future kind of measure. I'm not aware of anything on the neuroimaging side. There is a whole category of events. Actually, Carl and I have been talking about this in terms of thinking about a sort of a broad taxonomy of future thinking that you could think of as involving procedural memory that produce the kinds of implicit future simulations, if you will, of upcoming actions and so forth. So there's a whole literature on that. We don't typically relate to this. We don't typically talk about it in these terms. And we don't really know much about how those kinds of procedural future simulations, if you will, are related to what I've talked about. It's a very interesting and open question.
Thanks for the talk. The induction manipulation that you do, it reminds me a lot of the race study manipulation they do in the education literature. Have you thought of it in that way, or are there important differences that you could highlight?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, how that would relate. thought of that myself, because in the testing literature, of course, he usually studies control, and Carl will talk about some of that work from interpolated testing later on today. In those restudied conditions, there's no real guidance toward episodic detail. People are left on their own and they can do whatever they want, and it's more of an encoding thing. Here, the critical thing seems to be focusing in people on specific details of what happened in that video. Remember, all of our effects in the experiments I talked about are compared against a control condition where you're also re-studying, if you will. You're being asked to think back to the video, but you're not focusing on episodic detail. So I don't think that's there are probably anomalies.
That was a great talk, and one of the things that it cute to me is what we do now to train surgeons, which is to encourage them to undergo mental practice. So it's very interesting and encouraging to hear you talk about simulation as a very strong mental activity. The goal, or I guess the stated goal for this type of practice is to get the surgeons to encode better or develop a stronger schema for the motor skill and for that sort of categorization of the problem that they're dealing with, to sort of have a better mental representation of that expert task. Now, two questions come to mind. One is, what do you think this sort of episodic simulation, sort of future simulation, does for those past experiences in encoding that schema? And second, are there features of the simulation you think that are more important, or features of memory that you need to simulate more rigorously or more representatively than others that are sort of irrelevant or task not useful?
Right. I think to answer your latter question would probably be entirely task and situation dependent. It will just depend a lot on the task. The future task that you're faced with in terms of what's going to be relevant and what's going to be not, and almost any task will, I think, would have both. With respect to the first question about encoding, first of all, let me acknowledge it. There definitely is an overlap between this work and the mental practice literature. This comes at it. Clearly, there are overlapping processes when people talk about visualizing and subsequent motor action and stuff like that. This comes at it from a little bit of a different conceptual framework and breaks things down in a different way than is done in the mental practice literature. But on encoding, that's very important, and we've done a little bit of work on that, looking at the fate of these simulations, because an important point is, and this was made initially by David Ingvar back in the 1970s, who was a real pioneer in this area, who had the idea of memory for the future. That in these simulations, you simulate different ways in which the situation might turn out, and you lock into something you think might be useful. That's going to be useful in guiding behavior at a later time. It's important to remember those simulations. And so with Carl, we've done a little bit of work on that. With Donna Addis, one of her students, published a little work on neuroimaging work, looking at encoding what makes for a well-encoded versus poorly encoded future simulation, what brain regions are involved, what kinds of future simulations are better retained over as compared to others. And there's Spooner et al. Frontiers and Psychology paper, 2013, where we review all the literature that exists on that point.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker, so thank you very much to Dan.